I'm thrilled to be on a panel with a lot of ladies, which is not often the case when we're talking climate and energy and national security. So welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us. We're also waiting on another participant of the group, and we're going to just hope that she pops up at some point in the near future. I just want to welcome our panelists briefly. Annalena Moreno Bau is the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of Spain. Welcome. Annalena Baerbock, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Germany. It's great to have you here on the panel. As well as Anita Anand, the Minister of National Defense of Canada. Hello. How are you, Sherri? And Sherri Goodman, Secretary General, International Military Council on Climate and Security. Welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
I want to kick off by asking the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany to give us her assessment of President Zelensky's remarks at the G7, essentially saying that he would like the invasion to be over, the war to be over by the end of the year, and he would hope that all of Ukraine will be, once again, a sovereign nation. Do you believe that's a possibility and a realistic outlook?
Well, this is what we are all. My microphone is not working, obviously.
Technical difficulties.
Now, no.
Oh. Once again, and with some feeling. One of the things, obviously, that we've been talking about over the last couple of hours has been, obviously, the confluence, the nexus between energy security and national security. It's a subject that I've covered at length since I interviewed President Putin back in October, and I challenged him before an audience of hundreds of people in his own country about whether or not he was using energy as a weapon to fight democracy. And he denied it multiple times and then called me too beautiful to understand his answer. I'd like to pose now, once again, to the Foreign Minister. Still not having a microphone. Excellent. We're working on it. I think we're getting there. Anita, when you think about what happens next with regards to the energy situation, the Secretary General essentially saying to me earlier that he wanted to set new goals for NATO and change the course of the way we decarbonize armies, to decarbonize militaries, but you also have to have buy-in from the civilians as well, the civilian sector, if you will. Mm-hmm. How difficult do you think that it's going to be to continue to sell the climate change agenda at a time when higher energy prices are frankly making it very, very difficult for normal everyday life? And I'm just talking about across the West, beyond the situation in Ukraine.
It is an excellent point and a conundrum, but there is a way, there is a path forward here. The first thing we have to remember from a Canadian standpoint is what we are seeing in Canada represents what is happening all over the world. Between 1990 and 2010, there were just 6 Canadian Armed Forces domestic deployments to natural disasters. Since 2011, there have been 30. So this is the conundrum that we're focused on in Canada domestically, and it represents what the world at large is experiencing as well. And as we move to a greener future, interoperability is going to be key. And we know that interoperability is a keystone of NATO. And so what we've got to do with our batteries, with our charging stations, with our networks, with our tanks, we have to make sure that they're not only utilizing green technology, but that the interoperability piece is present. What that means for procurement is that our engagement with industry has to be consistent both domestically and internationally so that NATO allies are utilizing similar technology. And the final point I'll make is that I'm not sure if the audience knows, but at last year's Leaders Summit, Canada offered to establish and host a NATO Climate Change and Security Centre of Excellence to help NATO allies and global partners understand and adapt to these types of situations, which I'm pointing out right now in a climate-impacted security environment. And today I'm pleased to announce that we have selected Montreal, Quebec, in Canada to be the host city. And this is great news for Montreal, it's great news for Canada, and it's great news for NATO because Montreal is a thriving ecosystem of climate-focused businesses. And what we do need to do in the defense and security industry is to leverage our relationships with business to make sure that the products coming off the line, the batteries and the tanks and the charging stations, are green and can be utilized across the board.
Reiner was just mentioning in his comments earlier that the great tragedy here is that we are financing two armies, whether it be Vladimir Putin's war machine that is devastating Ukraine or our own NATO ally forces. I want to ask the Foreign Minister of Germany, who's with us, and hopefully has her mic working, to walk me through how realistic you think President Zelensky's hope of ending the war by the end of the year really is at this point, and having Ukraine intact as a sovereign state.
Well, this is, it's still not working. Well, maybe it's a boycott from someone else of the microphone, but then you cannot hear it outside. Well, I speak loud, and maybe in between we can find another cable that it can work again. Sir? Move me where?
To the podium here, the right.
Yeah. It's going to be standing room only.
No? Yes.
Yes.
Hooray!
But then I don't need this. If I speak with this?
Well, this is good. I mean, we're talking about so much hard stuff, so a bit laughing is good for the soul, I would say. But sitting here together with also the mayor of Kiev, I think we have to be very frank, and nobody knows, but we are doing everything that Ukraine will stay a sovereign state and that the whole country can live in peace and liberty all together. And as the President has underlined it, this is the hope, and this is why we have to do everything that the hope stays. And this is why also at this NATO Summit, we are underlining that we are not only continuing delivering hard weapons to Ukraine, but that we are increasing our efforts to do so. Because every day counts, and I think this is really important because we don't know how long this war will continue. It can stop tomorrow if the Russian president will end the bombing. It's all up to him. He can end the war tomorrow, and then we can face all the challenges we are having anyhow at the world. But if he's not doing so, every day counts also with military support. All the Ukrainians here in the audience know it better than I do. There are soldiers dying every day. There are civilians dying every day. So if we are increasing also weapons delivery, this helps saving lives also every day as this war is going on. And on the other hand, jumping to the topic we are having here, I think this is a big challenge, and this is also one of the strategies Putin is following, that we are forgetting about other crises, like the food war he's also launching, like the hybrid war on fake news, but also that we are forgetting about the climate crisis. And we see around the world, if we are forgetting about this crisis, other countries, other nations, other civilians will say, so why don't you care about us? So in this middle of the fight for the freedom, for the peace and liberty for Ukraine, we still have to keep up the efforts fighting the climate crisis, because it's the disaster of the 21st century.
How do you get the messaging right here? Because I live in a part of the world, the Middle East, that is not necessarily on board with the reaction of NATO allies to President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. When you talk to the billions of people outside of the West who look at the situation and say, we've got a cost of living crisis, we could potentially have famine, like in Africa, like in parts of the Middle East, what is your message to them? Why is this important?
Well, first of all, I'm not talking about the West. I think we really have to consider that we are living in the year 2022. And this is a war we are fighting between liberal democracies, those countries believing in the rule of international law, believing in the power of international law. And this was why it was so important that at the United Nations it was 141 countries, not only from Europe, not only from Northern America, not only from Australia, but around the globe, who said we do not accept this breach of international law. Because if we are accepting this, and I think this is the most important message from this Madrid NATO Summit, this fatigue which is there, saying, okay, maybe this is too hard to stand. But if we accept this, we will accept that one country is breaching everything we are standing for, and that we accept it in the end, this would be a loss for the United Nations in the end. And this is why, answering your question, when we go around the world, we are saying this is also about you. Every country in the world, almost every country, has a bigger neighbor. And if we accept here that a bigger and stronger and more powerful neighbor can just invade another country and we close our eyes, this can happen to everybody. And secondly, we are making clear, we do see, we hear, that also our countries, and there we can say from the past, Western countries did not act in some moments when other countries needed us. And I think this is a big challenge, and this is also where we have to be frank and clear that we don't close our eyes when we have fundamental violations of international law, of human rights. And this was also, for example, why I, as a foreign minister, made very clear when we had the reports on China that we are not being silent, even though in this tricky situation we also need China to have a stand there. But if we are starting to balance between one aggressor, one autocratic regime, and saying the other one is only a little worse, I think then we are also losing the trust in international law.
And just to follow on to that, after the G7 conversations over the weekend, there was a big push to float an idea of a price cap for Russian oil. Who should be leading those conversations? I asked the Secretary General. He said, that's not my remit. We know the International Energy Agency has said, that's not my remit either. Who's, in your view, going to have to lead this initiative? Is it going to have to be the EU or individual countries?
Well, if we believe in the international communities, then we have to be united. And this is our strongest asset, that we are united within the 141 states, which is not a given. We are losing countries, but that we are united within the EU, that we are united within NATO and G7. And I mean, everybody knows in the room we had the debate in Elmo, because this is also the difficult situation. And I mean, if it would be easy, all these problems would have been solved, that we see the countermeasures. If we put the price gap, and this has been discussed in Elmo, then it could be that in the end Russia wins even more. So if we are doing this, and we are in close contact because United States were proposing this firsthand, so we're in discussion it, we have to do it right. We saw it now with the war on corn. I mean, my heart bleeds that Putin is in a way successful with this. From the first minute on, we try to counter his narrative. But frankly speaking, I mean, we are not successful in every country. And this is why, for me, it's so important, if we are taking steps of sanction, we have to think above what is going to be his counter-reaction, what is going to be his narrative in the end. Because with the war on corn, we said, okay, there's no sanction on corn, there's no sanction on health, but anyhow, unluckily, some countries are believing it. So if we are doing this, we have to make sure that not other countries around the world who are anyhow suffering from high prices on energy, who do not have electricity anymore, because I mean Germany is a rich country. We spent more than 10 billion euros to counter the price effects on energy, and other countries cannot do it. So if we are talking about these kind of measures, we have to make sure that in the end, not this is a success for Putin again, because we have 15 countries out of the 141 saying, well, this is now hard enough for us. So we have to do it together, and we have to do it together in mind with those countries who have also effects of these measures we are taking. But in the end, it's all about Ukrainian people to save their life and to make sure that they will win this war.
Sherri, I want to bring you in on this one in terms of the U.S. response. Are you concerned by what you've been seeing over the last 2 years or so coming from the Biden administration? Because while there was a great deal of momentum at the very beginning of the administration when they came to office on the climate change and green energy initiative, as a result of higher energy prices and a host of other factors, the war in Ukraine, rising inflation, we've seen the Fed taking a stand. However, that hasn't brought prices down in any significant way. And we understand that the Secretary of Energy had a meeting with the oil and gas community in the United States, and it lasted less than an hour. So there seems to be a major disconnect between what the administration wants to get done and what they're able to get done at this point.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I really wish I could join you in person. I do think, it's a very difficult balancing act at this particular moment. But as we often say with the military community, and I'm here representing the International Military Council on Climate and Security, you have to be able to walk and chew gum. So, in the short term, yes, we need to ensure that we have adequate existing energy supplies to meet the daily needs of Americans and of others around the world. But we still have to move quickly because we experience the climate crisis as a threat multiplier now daily in our daily activities, from wildfires, from sea level rise, from extreme weather events, from extreme heat. We're experiencing this now all the time. And so our militaries have to be at the forefront of leading by example, becoming more, as Secretary General Stoltenberg said, setting the gold standard by enabling us to become more resilient, adapting our defense, and at the same time leading towards a decarbonized defense with the technologies which will allow us to decarbonize our society, from electrification to microgrids. And so I think we have to be able to do both. We have to meet urgent current needs, and yes, it's often a challenge, but we have to keep our eye also on the long-term health of our societies, our food security, and our energy security.
To you. When you think about what happens going forward, we're talking so much about, obviously, the climate change and the impact, frankly, that our militaries have on the world. Essentially, we've seen the Secretary General calling in his new strategy for a readiness force of 300,000. How difficult do you think it's going to be to maintain the climate change goals and at the same time secure Europe?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for gathering this meeting with five women, and talking about climate change. I think that in the past 40 years, we have done a big progress. Now, gender issues, equality, and climate change issues are in our DNA. They belong to all we deal with. They are cross-cutting. So I think they are here to remain, these questions. But of course, we are facing a war, and the war has terrible consequences on our environment, not only in terms of the gas emissions of weapons, the fires in the forests that we cannot stop. But of course, we are facing the oil and fossil fuel rise of the prices. So one thing we cannot do, of course, we are committed to give a resolute response to the aggression of Russia in Ukraine. But we cannot forget that we have a compromise with future generations. It's the survival of the species, of the planet, and we need to keep our roadmap to decarbonization, to a transition in our energies. So renewable energy has to be there. We need to, as the Secretary General of the United Nations said, we don't need to be hitting the brake. We need to be putting the pedal to the metal in terms of the energy transition. And this is an occasion to use this war as an opportunity to transition to a more ecological energy. I think that we are working on that. We are working on that in the European Union with our Repower EU program. We are working on that again in all our across all our programs in the European Union. We are working on that nationally. We are giving a response to our citizens also in this crisis. We are giving a response, and we are also helping them understand that they need to change their patterns of consumption. We need, as the International Energy Agency proposed, we need to give them some points, some patterns, some models to change their consumption patterns, so they can drive a bicycle instead of a car, they can put the heating a bit lower, they can walk a bit longer distances, and we need to put these in the minds of our population. We are at war. We are at war, and we need to transmit them that we have an economy of war. So we don't need, I think, to be so afraid to talk frankly to our population. They know very well what we are dealing with, and they are very supportive. I have to say that the Spanish population is 83% supportive of NATO now. This is not what we had 40 years ago. So it proves that the people of Spain are committed to supporting Ukraine against the Russian aggression. These allies committed to supporting Ukraine. And we need to be more confident in the capacity of the population to be responsible.
But will they be supporting Ukraine when it turns cold? When the cost of living crisis begins to really sink in?
Well, we need to keep on, as I said, putting the pedal to the metal in terms of renewable energy. We have solar energy, wind energy, plenty of solutions, green hydrogen. We need to be dealing with this.
Yeah. I want to get the Canadian perspective on this one, because obviously just to your south, your neighbors in the United States have had some pretty violent swings, if you will, when it comes to their climate policies over the last couple of years. And of course, that has impacted the oil and gas industry. We've seen them pumping a lot of their revenues back into shareholders' pockets, if you will, instead of reinvestment in the oil and gas sector. And that's something that's really, in many ways, derailed the transition. When you think about it from a perspective as a policymaker, what are some of the things that we should be focused on? Because when I speak to the CEOs of major oil and gas companies, like Exxon, like BP, like Eni, they essentially tell me this is a crisis in many ways of our own creating, and that we shouldn't be demonizing the industry at this point. We should be putting more emphasis on them moving toward renewables, but certainly not calling them to the carpet.
Well, thanks for the question. And certainly, as I said in my first remarks, industry is so important. I just want to take a moment and say hello to Mayor Klitschko and his brother from Ukraine. As you know, Canada stands with Ukraine, and we have an incredibly large Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, and we've been doing whatever we can to continue to build the bridge between Ukraine and Canada, and we'll keep going. In terms of the issues that you raised, I want to, if I could, just bring it to a security and defense perspective, given that this is a NATO conversation. And your question dealt more generally with industry, but I think we actually have to pull it into a security and defense analysis. And I will say a few things in that regard. What we have to do is we have to green defense. And we need industry to go along with us when we are doing that. But it is going to need to be pushed at a governmental level. And how do we green defense? Well, first of all, we need to identify places to improve energy efficiency in our infrastructure and in our commercial fleet. So whatever fleet we're talking about, whether it is our vehicle fleet, whether it is our armed vehicle fleets, whether it is our air or sea fleets, we need to be thinking about a green policy that addresses each aspect of air, land, and sea. And then we need to have that conversation with industry. So to your point, industry is focused to a large degree on their shareholder-driven profits. Actually, I used to be a corporate law professor, so I used to teach this to my students every year. But the other thing we have to remember is shareholders themselves are changing their views. There's something called ESG, environmental and social governance, and it is very strong amongst the major pension plans and institutional investors. So we are going to continue to see institutional investors taking a very strong approach on the need for climate and green policies in terms of the companies that they're investing in. Another thing we have to do is we have to make sure that new buildings are decked out with energy efficient technology, and that's going to require, again, government. When you are investing in new military bases across your countries, when you are selling off or purchasing assets, the green equation has to be built into the contracts that you are signing. And then finally, we have to test energy solutions and new technologies that can be used in our international deployments. And as we think about the war in Ukraine, as we donate vehicles and other military equipment to Ukraine, the issue of, as I said, interoperability becomes more and more poignant. And what I think we need to do as an alliance going forward is have this very conversation about interoperability in the green space. How do we ensure that what we are donating, for example, is interoperable? How do we ensure that what we are purchasing and investing in is interoperable in terms of having green energy solutions? And we have to reach our climate targets, and we have to do that regardless of the current situation and going forward. This has got to be a long-term goal, or we will have the tragedy of the commons eating all of us and our resources alive.
I want to follow on to that for the Foreign Minister of Germany, if you could. I hope we fixed your mic now, but when you think about this a bit more broadly and you think about partners in the energy space, obviously what's happened with Russia has upended the energy dynamic for at least another generation. Ukraine is looking to be a transition hub. It's looking to be a part of the grid to link up with Eastern Europe, the Three Seas area, and provide energy solutions, renewables, a big part of that, to the rest of Europe. How do you see Germany working with Ukraine specifically and the Eastern European countries to make that a reality? Because according to folks I'm speaking to, with a few $1 billion of investment, renewables could be up and running in the next 3 years. How does that factor into your forward planning in order to incorporate them into your energy mix?
Well, it's the major part, because it's not an energy mix anymore. We decided as a new government before the war that we are phasing out with all fossil fuels, starting by coal, but also gas, that gas infrastructure is only allowed till a certain time, and afterwards operators lose their permission, because we have experienced if we are not doing this, we are paying a lot of money to get the phasing out realized. And I'm not in line with your thesis saying that this process has stopped. Actually, it's the opposite. I see in so many countries, in so many regions, also like in my country, we have also parts of Germany where not everybody is saying, well, great, build the next windmill. But at this moment, this is not only a question about saving our planet, saving our lives, saving the climate. This is a question for peace. And I've been arguing for myself for a couple of years already, saying that the dependency on fossil fuels is also a geostrategic question. And now we brutally see that this is reality. So renewable energy is actually also a form of liberty energy. Mm-hmm. And this is why it's so important, if we are investing now so much money, that we are doing it right. And we started, for example, having the Moldova conference because they need also the security that we are there, that we are with them, because Russia, again, with fossil fuels, was trying to kill them by cutting them off the electricity, by saying the price is so high that Moldova is not capable of paying it anymore. So now we are supporting them, and we connected them also with regard to the grid, as we did with Ukraine. And again, this is not a question only of energy. This is a question of solidarity, and in the end, this is a question of survival. And we connected them, but also we are building renewable power plants in Moldova. when I was in Ukraine before the war started, I was discussing with the Ukrainian government about hydrogen project with German companies from wind parks. And this was also, for example, one of the reasons why we, as one of the last countries, said we close our embassies. Because the question now is that investors are not like leaving the country, and we are back in Ukraine with our embassy, making clear that it's so crucial that companies invest, even though it's difficult, and we support these kind of investments into renewable energy. And worldwide, this is also something when I go abroad, obviously we need new sources of renewable energy, making clear that this is interconnected. We as Germany, we can never face a situation again that we can be blackmailed because we are depending totally on one country. And this is also so important, making clear to other countries that the rule of law, that human rights, this is connected to our investments, and that our investments are connected to CO2. And as my colleague has said, it's all the question about companies and the pricing. So that's why we are lobbying so much also for CO2 price, not only within the European Union, and this is something we have to discuss also with our friends across the Atlantic Ocean. This is why for us as G7 presidency it was so important to say subsidies for fossil infrastructure. This is not the way to go forward, because if we do it right, we can promise, or we can keep up our promise we gave in 2015 at the climate COP. Some of you have been there as me in Paris. We did not only promise, which we didn't do in the years afterward, that we will bring the world on this track below 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. We also promised towards Africa that we are using this momentum of electrification to also electrify Africa, and we haven't done so. So the question of investment, of renewable energy, of energy independency is highly connected to development, and nothing from this can be killed by the Russian war. We have to bring everything together, and I think at this moment there is, in these horrible times, this chance of doing it way faster than we actually thought a couple of months ago.
And even still, we're talking about this energy transition. U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to go to Saudi Arabia and Israel in just a few weeks from now. There are a lot of conversations in my part of the world about what he's actually hoping to achieve. From Germany's perspective, does OPEC have a role to play here? Because as OPEC, they also have a very distinct relationship with Russia, and China is the largest foreign direct investor in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf Arab countries. So when you think about them as a potential conduit for a conversation or having some leverage there, what does Germany believe OPEC's role ought to be in this current crisis?
The question is which crisis, but OPEC plays a role in both crises. The Russian war on Ukraine, I've talked also to the governments. Unfortunately, then COVID came in between, so I couldn't go there in person. But, well, obviously, they have also the power to say how much oil they are producing at the current momentum, and it's a decision by them if they would produce more oil or if they wouldn't. And on the other hand, as I said, when we are talking about future contracts also on renewable energy, then the question of rule of law is crucial. This is also something for these countries. And again, I mean, I'm always in this time also positive thinking, otherwise you shouldn't go into politics, I think. We had just a conference on food security, and there were also ministers from OPEC countries. And they have also made clear that they understand that they have a responsibility also with regard to the food crisis. I think there are countries which can do more, but we have to work together. If I may, I would like to jump a bit more on the climate crisis and the question of security, because the big challenge we are facing is like in regions like Sahel, where the climate crisis hits together with the food crisis and the security crisis. And that climate really works as a crisis accelerator. This is something we really do have to understand. I think it's really important that in the new NATO strategic concept, we understand that one of the major points is to understand that the climate crisis is a security issue. A couple of years ago, people said this is soft politics, like female foreign politics as well. But now we understand that this is hard stuff, because the wars are going about water. They are about natural resources. If you are in Mali, and you used to build, to grow cotton on your fields, and you're not capable of doing this anymore because it has 50 degrees. I mean, it's so easy for terrorist organizations to come to the villages and say, well, we do have a job for your son. He can be one of our soldiers. So bringing this up on the international level is something else we have to do. Building renewable, but understanding if we are not winning this fight on the climate crisis, we are losing security all around the world.
Can I just add a sentence on to that point, which is I 100% agree with you that we need to actually elevate the climate crisis to a national security risk. And if we don't all actually understand that climate mishaps and climate crises, whether it's forest fires, whether it's floods, whether it's tornadoes, if we don't recognize that those are security risks, we won't actually be able to engage military and broader communities in the conversation about how to address them. And that's why I think this conversation is so useful, because what we really need to do is get past the point that it's a national security risk. I think we all should agree with that. And then we should be talking about how we can address it, what's on the to-do list, how we can coordinate across national and international borders to come up with the plan going forward.
I just want to mention that there are microphones on both sides of the room. If there are questions from the audience, you can maneuver over to one of these microphones and I'll come to you. One of the questions that we had polled folks within the Munich Security Conference and the NATO Public Forum was one about pessimism and optimism. Essentially, are you more pessimistic or more optimistic over the last 5 years, what we've seen in the energy space? And I'd just like to get a sense from the Minister of Spain what you feel is going well and what you feel is not going so well, because obviously the Russian war in Ukraine has upended this conversation to a huge degree.
Well, obviously the situation in our security is gloomy. It is very bad, worse than 6 months ago. But the fact that we are maintaining this conversation is leads me to being optimistic, because we need to carry on walking and to carry on working for the survival of the species. I think that this is great. The fact that we finally connect security and climate change, and that we speak about the Sahel and Africa in our NATO security concept, the fact that we, European Union, are the first donor in Africa trying to develop infrastructures, go through the entire Agenda 2030, through all the SDGs, and work on health, on food security, etc. Of course, much more has to be done, but connecting all these issues is essential. Looking from a security perspective, looking from a development perspective, a political perspective, and connecting everything is going to help us very much, as well as connecting all partners. SDG 17 is key. We have to be working with international organizations, with the private sector, with civil society, NGOs, with academia. And the fact is, we are all going through the same tracks. We are all speaking about climate change and security in different fora. We are all dealing with food insecurity at this very moment, but we are also trying to pass messages to those third countries which will be more affected by the food security. We are trying to get the grain out of Ukraine, so we are really committed to the future of our Agenda 2030, and I think that this is very good news, so I'm optimistic.
Yeah. Sherri, I want to bring you in on this one. When you think about whether you're pessimistic or optimistic, this is a subject you've been covering for quite a while.
Yes, and thank you. And I want to thank our Canadian partners for stepping up to lead the Center of Excellence on Climate and Security. I think it's a wonderful addition to NATO. And to our German and Spanish ministers, thank you both for your leadership in this area, for connecting climate and security, for Spain's hosting of this event, and for our Ukrainian partners. Never again should an aggressor be able to weaponize energy and cost so many innocent lives. And that's what makes me, at the end, be optimistic that we are connecting the dots here from the prolonged drought and desertification that is upending the Sahel and allowing terrorists to wreak havoc with climate-induced crises across the region, to a changing Arctic with retreating sea ice and collapsing permafrost. We have a whole new ocean that's opened up in our lifetimes, and not only does that create a new geopolitical and geostrategic risks and different dynamics in that region, but it could lead to widespread ecological damage as the permafrost thaws, releases increased methane, and beyond. So we have to realize that climate is very much part of our security. Now, when we think about how our militaries, and NATO, of course, is a defense organization, can lead in this, militaries have been organizations leading technological innovation for decades. And here's another way in which green defense procurement can also give us a competitive advantage on the battlefield. We're now in an era where we have to deal with contested logistics. We know in Iraq and Afghanistan, we lost one soldier for every 24 convoys supplying fuel and water to the front in those wars. We can't afford that anymore. As we green our supply lines and we improve energy supportability and reduce our demand, we will be a more efficient fighting force and therefore be able to provide better deterrence and defense for our societies and enable future peace and security. And that's what our young people are demanding. That's why I'm very pleased that we had Katerina is a NATO young leader. We have other youth. The youth that I work with, that many of you all work with all the time, are demanding of us greater action on environmental security and environmental peace building, and we owe it to the next generation.
Minister Baerbock, I know you have to leave in just a few minutes, but I want to get a sense from you, if you will, when we talk about energy security, climate security, and frankly, national defense or collective defense in this case, I think we can all understand at this point why it's so interconnected, that it's pretty much talking about the same thing. Take a step back. I asked you a bit about OPEC. Yesterday, we heard some off-mic sound coming from President Macron. He was speaking to Joe Biden, essentially asking him whether or not he'd heard this comment from Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince, or rather now President of the UAE, that they had reached capacity. And when I speak to my sources in the GCC, essentially, they're already failing to meet the targets that they'd set simply because the capacity, it's not that it's not there, but they haven't reached it yet, because as we all know with oil and gas, you just can't turn the tap on and expect the product to be there. There is some work that goes into getting it to market. Are you concerned that we're going to see continued times of higher oil prices in the coming months? And I'm talking about $120 a barrel, because certainly that has implications for the electorate, for whether or not people are going to be on board for supporting governments, the NATO alliance, in its fight against Vladimir Putin and defense of Europe.
Yes, it can be. And I mean, we are faced now in Germany with the question if there's no gas coming through Nord Stream 1. I mean, we are discussing, my colleague Robert Habeck, Minister for Economy and Climate, he has announced our second alarm step. The third one would be that we have to decide which institution or actor in society can be cut off the grid. I mean, we are in a time of war. Ukraine is in a time of war, that people are dying, but we are in a hybrid war where the war is also being done by energy. But I mean, the question is, so
what would be the opposite? I mean, first of all, we cannot change it in a way because we are trying to do everything to end this war. But as this war is going to continue, as I said before, we won't take back any form of sanction or anything like this, because then Mr. Putin wins. And this is nothing, this is no option. So this is why we have to stay tough. We have to prepare for everything. And this is why we have to think out of the box. And I mean, we have seen in the last weeks and also months that things are suddenly possible which haven't been possible before. I know my country obviously the best. We have been discussing for planning for new windmills. It took in the past 7 years. If you have a political will of saying energy and renewable energy is a question of security now, I mean, you have the possibility to change regulation quite fast with the parliament, obviously. But, I mean, we have to use this momentum. We have to make things possible which we haven't done in the past without getting stuck in the next crisis. And I think this is the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is that we are thinking in old boxes and thinking the only way out is another form of fossil energy. And then we are stuck in a couple of years realizing that this doesn't help at all. So we have to do it now on 2 tracks together. This is why when we are asking other countries for support with liquefied gas, we are not saying, okay, we are going only into liquefied gas. What I said before, we are building the infrastructure that in a couple of years, this is only green hydrogen coming through this. This is why we are also looking at climate partnerships with other countries with renewable energy. We are not going to the OPEC countries and saying, where's the fossil energy? We are going to the countries saying, where's the renewable energy? And I think this is...
But you are talking to Qatar.
Yes, with regard to gas, as what I said, as a bridge, and telling them this hydrogen has to be green in a couple of years. And I mean, this is realpolitik. Yeah, you have to think for the next weeks and months and then combine it with a plan for the next years coming up. And I would like to, sorry that I think the two of us always coming back to NATO at this, because we are NATO meeting, because I think we shouldn't think about it as like crises far above. Yeah, in my hometown, there have been like fires in the woods the last days for days again, and we have 130 fires already, even though it's not summer yet. And this is not Spain. This is Eastern Germany, and the same for NATO. The climate crisis and the danger that we have actually a war because of climate. Yes, this is something for countries where we are talking about Israel and others, where you can also use it as a peace solution. Mm-hmm. But if we are looking for Greece and Turkey, for example, if we are looking at countries within our NATO alliance, we also have to face that we are having a water problem in a couple of months. If we're looking, as our friend and colleague said, at the polar, the melting ice, this is also a security question. If the ice is melting, we have new conflicts in this area. So climate crisis is not only a question for conflict in other regions far above, it's also a NATO question, and this is why we also have to prepare these kind of things within NATO, and that's why it's so important that also this part is into the new strategic concept.
If I could just build on what she said again. What windmills so important, and other infrastructure to address the climate crisis. But governments can't do this alone. That's the key. We can't enact the legislation and expect miraculously for industry to turn and automatically produce what we need. We need to bring industry with us, and we need to ensure that they see themselves as part of the solution. Just like when we speak with industry relating to the provision of military aid to Ukraine. This is not something we can do without industry. Industry has to step up and produce the military aid, the drones, the ammunition, the continued equipment that we're providing to Ukraine. Similarly, in the environmental context, we need to ensure that they see themselves as part of the equation and the solution. And how do you do that? They have to be involved right now in the conversation relating to the solutions going forward on climate, or we won't be able to solve this crisis nationally or internationally.
Yes. During the pandemic, we were mankind was able to work together, private-public associations, to produce vaccines in a matter of months, and to vaccinate and to give a solution. Of course, we still have some COVID going on, but the majority of the countries are safe now. We can do the same in the energy sector. We just need to be investing, working in public-private alliances, and understand that the more we keep on consuming fossil fuels, the more we are financing the Russian aggression on Ukraine. So it's a matter of coherence that we need to keep in mind.
Before I close it out, I just want to get your sense, each of you, quite briefly, on the panel question that we had asked earlier in the day. In 10 years, the main security challenge facing the NATO alliance will be climate change, Russia, China, or something altogether different. Anita, if you'd like to kick it off.
Well, I think it's important that we don't isolate different types of risk. Rather, we need to see risk as interrelated. So what that means is we can't separate military from climate, from food, and other types of risks. They're actually all interrelated. And so this is one of your question is a little misleading if you look at it that way. I think we need to actually have a full-fledged, interrelated conception of risk at an international level, including at NATO, so that when we think about food crises, when we think about military crises, when we think about environmental crises, we're actually doing it under one umbrella as opposed to separate silos. Separate silos are dangerous in terms of planning for the future. This is all interrelated, and countries need to, I think, cooperate to address it together.
Minister Baerbock.
Well, I totally agree that these are all challenges we are facing. This is why in this concept we are addressing China, we are addressing obviously Russia and the climate crisis. But because I believe that politics can make a difference, if I have to pick, I would choose climate crisis, because, I mean, this is a difficult thing. With Russia, also with China, yeah, it's humans we, in the end, hopefully, we can deal with. But with the climate crisis, and this is why we cannot say we stop the climate crisis, we are already on the path towards 3 or 4 degrees. If we are doing the best, and this is what we are working on for the next years, then we will be below 2 degrees. But still, also then, we are facing the effects. And this is why it's not only about mitigation, it's all about adaptation and also about loss and damage for those regions we cannot save. They are islands we won't be able to save. And therefore, this climate topic will unfortunately stay forever, but we can make the difference between 4 degrees and 1.5.
Minister Bau.
Yes. Today's or the current NATO concept has a 360 degrees approach, which means that everything is comprised, all areas, geographical areas, but also all ideas, the nuclear, the geographical threats, energy, migration as a hybrid threat, etc. What is the real threat is underdevelopment. Underdevelopment and climate change are very interrelated, and this is a threat that people are displaced, that people are prone to terrorist attacks and to terrorist recruitment. So all combined is what we are facing. So underdevelopment is what we really need to tackle.
Sherri?
Well, thank you. I've seen in my lifetime that our national security risks have converged with our environmental and climate risks. Starting out, in the Cold War, and actually my first job was at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and during the Cold War, and so much has changed during this time, but the convergence of climate and environmental risks, along with food and water security, are now very intimately connected with the full scope of security challenges that NATO faces. And that's why I think it's so important that NATO has put this forefront in its strategic concept, that it's held this forum today, because that's how we're going to secure a better future for our generation and for future generations, which is by understanding how those climate and environmental risks integrate across all dimensions of risk, and so that we can better protect either by making more resilient, and I think NATO has led and will continue to lead on that way, make more resilient our societies and our military, and also lead us through the tough challenges we face now, both with aggression, but with the energy transition, and show the way how even in tough times we are able to make that energy transition lead us to a more secure future.
Panelists, thank you so much. We actually made it to time. Congratulations on a great conversation.
Thank you.
Which we managed.
Thank you.